The North Sea was a corridor of terror long before the kingdoms of England and Francia fully understood the scale of the threat from the north. On mist-shrouded mornings, Norse longships glided silently across waters once assumed to be protective barriers. Coastal monasteries, isolated along riverbanks or on islands, became the focus of their raids. These sacred sites, devoted to prayer, manuscript preservation, and ritual, were materially wealthy, but militarily defenseless. In 793, the monastery of Lindisfarne endured the first documented strike that would echo across Christendom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records monks slaughtered, relics desecrated, and treasure seized. This was not random cruelty. It was calculated, a projection of power meant to destabilize communities incapable of organized defense. The news traveled rapidly, spreading fear along the coasts and rivers of northern Europe, establishing a reputation for the Norse as unpredictable and lethal raiders who relied on speed and surprise rather than occupation. The political context amplified vulnerability. In England, the Heptarchy consisted of fragmented kingdoms whose rulers were often at odds, incapable of coordinating defense along exposed coasts. Francia, though powerful under the Carolingian dynasty, struggled to project authority along distant rivers and coastlines. Norse raiders exploited these structural weaknesses, choosing targets not only for wealth but for symbolic impact. Monasteries represented centers of both spiritual and material power, repositories of treasure and knowledge, and therefore strategic points of leverage. By striking them, raiders undermined the credibility of local authorities, demonstrating the limits of secular and ecclesiastical protection. Isolation and the fragmentation of political power created opportunities the Norse understood instinctively, transforming rivers, coasts, and estuaries into conduits of terror. Viking military adaptation made these raids devastatingly effective. Longships were technologically sophisticated, designed for speed, shallow water navigation, and rapid deployment. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia confirm that these vessels balanced mobility with cargo capacity. Raiders were lightly armored, armed with spears, axes, and occasionally bows, relying on swift, lethal action against minimally defended targets. Monasteries, with timber gates and low stone walls, offered little resistance. Each strike was designed to maximize terror and minimize risk, a combination of logistics, planning, and psychological warfare. Mobility and timing allowed small forces to achieve results that larger armies could not, illustrating the Norse mastery of asymmetrical strategy. The methods of assault were brutal in their efficiency. Monastic defenses were minimal. Gates could be breached, walls scaled, and residents untrained for combat. Fire was a common tool, employed to destroy wooden structures and force submission. Treasure chambers were ransacked, relics desecrated, and sacred spaces violated. Archaeological evidence corroborates historical accounts. Burned timber, looted items, and skeletal remains indicate both speed and precision. The concept of siege for the Vikings was unconventional. It relied not on prolonged attrition, but immediate exploitation of vulnerability. They struck quickly, achieved objectives, and withdrew, leaving devastation behind. Every action reflected a strategic understanding of what could be accomplished before resistance consolidated. Psychological warfare amplified physical destruction. Chroniclers recount clergy killed before the eyes of survivors and sacred relics removed to maximize shock. Fear spread rapidly, reaching villages beyond the immediate site of attack. Raiders leveraged this reputation to limit organized defense, making terror itself a strategic tool. The perception of invincibility extended the effect of each strike far beyond its physical footprint. Communities internalized vulnerability, altering settlement patterns, economic activity, and social cohesion. In this way, the impact of raids extended across entire regions, with reputation and terror becoming as powerful as weapons in shaping outcomes. Case studies illustrate methodical patterns. After Lindisfarne, Monasteries such as Jarrow, Iona, and Rathlin suffered similar attacks. In Francia, monasteries along the Seine and Loire faced repeated incursions, exploiting environmental conditions such as low tides or frozen rivers. Archaeological digs reveal burned layers and looted caches, confirming historical accounts. Patterns indicate that targets were chosen systematically, isolated, wealthy, and defenseless. The cumulative effect was social, economic, and cultural disruption. Monastic centers were not only religious hubs, but also centers of literacy, land management, and local governance. Their destruction destabilized broader societal networks, reinforcing the Norse strategic leverage. Long-term consequences were significant. Economically, the loss of wealth and agricultural stores disrupted subsistence and trade. Culturally, manuscripts and relics were destroyed, erasing centuries of accumulated knowledge. Politically, repeated vulnerability highlighted weaknesses in secular authority, prompting some rulers to invest in fortification and regional coordination. Socially, fear influenced settlement patterns and defensive behavior, driving communities to cluster in fortified locations or relocate entirely. By the mid-9th century, stone walls, moats, and defensive towers appeared, illustrating an adaptive response, though the psychological impact of prior raids endured, shaping perception and behavior long after the immediate danger had passed. Strategic adaptation followed. Coastal and riverine communities developed early warning systems and scouting networks, while kings invested in fortified towns capable of resisting attacks and serving as refuges. Military logistics evolved alongside urban planning, prioritizing rapid response and resource protection. Seasonal timing, tides, and weather were incorporated into strategic calculations, demonstrating environmental awareness and operational sophistication. Defensive and administrative reforms reflected lessons learned, as monasteries and settlements attempted to integrate structural, procedural, and tactical measures to mitigate the effectiveness of raiders. A dynamic tension emerged between the relentless innovation of raiders and adaptive resilience of communities. Broader geopolitical impact emerged as well. Viking raids influenced alliances, ecclesiastical reform, and administrative organization. Repeated attacks prompted consolidation of authority and coordination among secular and religious leaders. Monasteries developed systematic record-keeping to track raids, routes, and patterns, creating an intelligence infrastructure that informed future planning. These archives preserved operational knowledge for posterity, allowing historians to reconstruct the precise methods, timing, and impact of Norse attacks. The raids serve as catalysts for societal evolution, forcing communities to integrate security, administration, and economic resilience into strategies previously dominated by spiritual priorities. Ultimately, Viking raids on monasteries represent early asymmetric warfare. Raiders leveraged mobility, terror, and precision to achieve strategic results far beyond the size of their forces. The combination of physical destruction, psychological disruption, and economic destabilization reshaped political and religious landscapes. By the late 9th century, monasteries had evolved into fortified, dual-purpose institutions, centers of devotion and nodes of defense. Fear and disruption remained enduring legacies, while chronicles, annals, and archaeology preserve the evidence of systematic, calculated operations. The raids demonstrate the interplay of speed, environmental awareness, and strategic terror in medieval conflict, leaving an enduring imprint on Northern European society, governance, and culture, and revealing the calculated logic behind a pattern of destruction that shaped an entire era. The aftermath of Viking raids extended far beyond the immediate destruction of monasteries. Survivors were confronted with ruins, loss of life, and profound social disruption. Monks and local populations described the suddenness of attacks, noting the precision with which raiders navigated rivers and coasts. Material loss was only one element. Manuscripts, relics, and sacred structures were destroyed, undermining centuries of accumulated knowledge and spiritual authority. Communities that had relied on monasteries for administration, education, and land management found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Sanctity offered no protection, and wealth became a liability. The fear generated by these attacks spread faster than the raiders themselves, reshaping settlement patterns, economic behavior, and social cohesion in the regions most affected. Monasteries responded in several ways, though measures were often reactive. Valuable manuscripts and relics were moved inland or to fortified locations to minimize risk. Defensive architecture evolved incrementally. Timber palisades were replaced by stone walls, and watchtowers were added at strategic points. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Repton, Jarrow, and Iona shows multiple layers of fortification interspersed with burned deposits, indicating repeated cycles of attack and reconstruction. Despite these improvements, raiders could bypass or overwhelm defenses due to the mobility of longships. Adaptation relied on structural reinforcement, procedural planning, and the cultivation of psychological resilience, reflecting a pragmatic response to a highly mobile and unpredictable threat. Environmental awareness was integral to Viking strategy. Raids were frequently timed for late spring or early summer, when rivers were navigable and tides favorable. In some instances, frozen rivers allowed access to inland sites normally considered secure. Chroniclers also note that attacks coincided with political distractions, such as succession crises or local conflicts, limiting the possibility of organized defense. Geography and timing were exploited to maximize the element of surprise and amplify both material and psychological effects. Rivers, estuaries, and tidal flats became tools of operational advantage, illustrating the Vikings' sophisticated understanding of environmental conditions as instruments of warfare. The psychological impact of repeated raids was profound. Survivors reported widespread fear, flight, and disruption of daily life. Villagers abandoned low-lying settlements, relocating to fortified towns or moving further inland. Agricultural productivity declined, trade slowed, and local governance became more challenging. Chroniclers emphasized the terror inflicted on clergy and lay populations, revealing that perception of invincibility often had as much effect as physical destruction. Communities internalized vulnerability, adjusting behavior in anticipation of raids, which extended the strategic influence of raiders beyond the immediate strike. Fear itself became a force multiplier, shaping economic and social patterns across large regions. Economic disruption was severe and long-lasting. Monasteries functioned as hubs of storage, production, and trade. Looted agricultural stores and livestock undermined subsistence, while stolen treasures reduced fiscal capacity. Repeated assaults along rivers, such as the Seine and Loire, disrupted trade, decreasing revenues and increasing expenditure on defense. Numismatic studies reveal reduced coin circulation in heavily raided areas, reflecting both loss and diminished confidence in economic stability. The combination of physical destruction, disrupted trade, and population displacement magnified the effects of raids, ensuring that their consequences persisted far beyond immediate material losses. The destruction of knowledge compounded these effects. Monastic libraries and archives contained manuscripts, administrative records, and historical texts accumulated over generations. The loss of these materials disrupted literacy, clerical administration, and scholarly continuity. Surviving monks often relocated fragments of text to secondary sites with inadequate preservation resources. Archaeological evidence from charred libraries and manuscripts corroborates historical accounts, revealing widespread intellectual and cultural loss. By targeting knowledge alongside wealth and personnel, raiders inflicted multidimensional damage, undermining social structures, governance, and the cultural memory of affected regions. Military adaptation arose in response to the persistent threat. Fortifications became more common along coasts and river approaches. Stone walls, palisades, and watchtowers were combined with organized scouting networks to provide early warning. Kings and abbots coordinated mobile militias capable of responding to incursions, though their effectiveness varied according to leadership, terrain, and proximity to fortified settlements. Archaeological evidence shows repeated construction, destruction, and reconstruction of defensive works, demonstrating a continuous learning process. Defensive strategies integrated static fortification with tactical mobility, reflecting an understanding that the speed and surprise of Viking raids required both observation and responsive action. The geopolitical consequences were substantial. Recurrent attacks prompted the consolidation of political authority, as smaller territories sought protection under larger structures. Ecclesiastical reform was shaped by vulnerability, with resources directed towards safeguarding personnel, knowledge, and treasure rather than solely devotional work. Monastic institutions developed systematic documentation of raids, recording routes, patterns, and tactics. These archives preserved operational knowledge, informing future regional defense and providing modern historians with detailed insight into Viking strategy. Sustained raids thus catalyzed institutional evolution, integrating security into religious, administrative, and economic systems, forcing society to adapt to constant external pressure. Viking targeting of monasteries exemplified early asymmetric warfare. Raiders leveraged mobility, speed, and psychological terror to achieve effects far greater than their number suggested. Physical destruction was combined with economic, cultural, and social destabilization. Raids followed predictable patterns but struck unpredictably, ensuring ongoing vulnerability. Unlike conventional campaigns aimed at territorial conquest, Viking operations emphasized destabilization, resource extraction, and reputational dominance. Fear itself became a strategic tool, compelling populations to invest in defense, altering settlement patterns, and shaping economic and religious behavior. The combination of psychological manipulation and tactical precision reveals a highly sophisticated operational mindset that exploited societal vulnerabilities systematically. By the end of the 9th century, monasteries had transformed into fortified dual-purpose institutions, serving both spiritual and defensive functions. Walls, watchtowers, early warning systems, and mobile response units reflected lessons learned under sustained predation. Yet psychological and material scars persisted. Fear, social disruption, and economic vulnerability remained deeply ingrained. The Norse, through precision, mobility, and strategic projection of terror, exercised influence far beyond the reach of their longships. Chronicles, annals, and archaeological evidence preserve this systematic pattern of destruction and adaptation, illustrating the lasting consequences of raids. The legacy of Viking incursions demonstrates the intersection of strategy, mobility, and societal resilience, reshaping political, economic, and religious structures across northern Europe for generations. By the mid-9th century, Viking raids had become a persistent and destabilizing force across northern Europe. Coastal settlements, riverine towns, and monasteries experienced repeated attacks that reshaped both physical structures and social organization. Monasteries, once secure centers of worship, learning, and local governance, were revealed as vulnerable nodes within broader networks of wealth and knowledge. Survivors consistently described the speed of raiders, their ability to navigate rivers and estuaries, and the precise selection of targets rich in treasure, manuscripts, and relics. The immediate physical destruction was severe, yet the social and psychological consequences extended far beyond the walls of any single institution. Religious life was disrupted, economic networks were weakened, and the authority of secular rulers was challenged, demonstrating that the reach of Viking strategy extended well beyond material gain. Communities developed adaptive responses, though these were often reactive. Monasteries moved valuable relics and manuscripts inland or to fortified locations, attempting to preserve their intellectual and spiritual assets. Defensive architecture evolved gradually. Timber palisades were replaced with stone walls, gates were reinforced, and watchtowers were erected at strategic vantage points. Excavations at Repton, Jarrow, and Iona reveal multiple layers of construction interspersed with burned deposits, indicating repeated cycles of attack and reconstruction. Yet these measures could not fully neutralize the advantages of the Norse. Longships allowed raiders to bypass defenses, strike swiftly, and withdraw before local forces could organize. Adaptation relied on structural reinforcement, procedural planning, and psychological preparation, demonstrating the monastery's evolving understanding of an agile and unpredictable enemy. Environmental and seasonal awareness amplified Viking operational effectiveness. Raids were often timed for late spring or early summer, when rivers were navigable and tides permitted rapid inland movement. In colder regions, frozen rivers occasionally enabled access to settlements that would otherwise have been secure. Chroniclers also note that raids frequently coincided with political distractions, including succession disputes or regional conflicts, limiting the likelihood of coordinated defense. Geography and timing were exploited to magnify the effect of surprise and the psychological impact of the attack. Rivers, estuaries, and tidal flats became tactical tools, demonstrating the Vikings' sophisticated understanding of the environment as a component of military strategy. The psychological effects of repeated raids were profound. Survivors reported widespread fear and displacement, as villages along rivers and coasts were abandoned in favor of fortified towns or inland relocation. Agricultural production declined, trade slowed, and local governance suffered. Monks, accustomed to sanctity and the protection of their institutions, experienced trauma as raiders violated sacred spaces and desecrated relics. Chroniclers emphasize that the perception of invincibility often had a greater effect than the physical destruction itself. Fear became a strategic multiplier, forcing communities to divert labor and resources to defense, extending the raiders' influence beyond the immediate attack and shaping behavior across entire regions. Economic disruption compounded the social and psychological consequences. Monasteries were centers of production, storage, and trade. Looted agricultural stores and livestock undermined local subsistence, while stolen gold and silver reduced fiscal capacity for both religious and secular authorities. Repeated raids along rivers such as the Seine and Loire disrupted commerce, decreasing revenue and forcing investment in defensive infrastructure. Numismatic evidence indicates reduced coin circulation in raided regions, reflecting both physical loss and diminished confidence in economic stability. The cumulative effect of material deprivation, social disruption, and pervasive fear ensured that Viking influence extended beyond the immediate scope of the attacks, demonstrating a form of long-term strategic advantage. The destruction of knowledge further destabilized affected regions. Monastic libraries, scriptoria, and archives contained manuscripts, administrative records, and religious texts accumulated over centuries. Fire, theft, and dispersal disrupted literacy, clerical administration, and scholarly continuity. Surviving monks often relocated fragments of text to secondary sites, where preservation resources were limited. Archaeological evidence, including charred manuscripts and burned structures, confirms widespread intellectual and cultural loss. The targeting of knowledge alongside material wealth reveals a deliberate strategy aimed at undermining social cohesion, governance, and the cultural memory of the affected communities. The effects of these attacks were multidimensional, extending far beyond immediate physical damage. Military and strategic adaptation emerged as a direct response. Fortifications became central to defense planning. Stone walls, timber palisades, and watchtowers were integrated into broader defensive networks. Scouts and lookouts were stationed along rivers and coastlines to provide early warning, while local militias were organized to respond rapidly to incursions. The effectiveness of these measures varied with leadership, terrain, and proximity to garrison towns. Archaeological evidence indicates repeated cycles of fortification, destruction, and reconstruction, illustrating the incremental development of defensive strategies. Communities sought to combine static fortifications with mobile response capabilities, recognizing that the speed and flexibility of Viking forces require dynamic solutions. The geopolitical implications of repeated raids were substantial. Smaller political entities consolidated under larger authorities to coordinate resources and strengthen defensive capacity. Ecclesiastical reform was influenced by vulnerability, with attention focused on safeguarding personnel, knowledge, and treasure, as well as devotional activities. Monastic institutions developed systematic documentation of raids, recording routes, attack patterns, and raider tactics. These early intelligence networks informed regional planning, allowing better allocation of defensive resources and coordination between secular and religious authorities. Sustained raids catalyzed institutional evolution, embedding security into governance, administration, and economic planning while shaping the long-term resilience of communities. Viking targeting of monasteries illustrates asymmetric warfare. Raiders combined speed, mobility, and psychological intimidation to achieve results far exceeding their numbers. Physical destruction was accompanied by social, economic, and cultural destabilization. Raids followed predictable patterns but occurred unpredictably in timing, maintaining long-term vulnerability. Unlike conventional military campaigns aimed at territorial conquest, these operations emphasized destabilization, resource extraction, and reputation building. Fear itself became a tool of strategy, compelling populations to invest in fortifications, alter settlement patterns, and redirect economic and social behavior toward security. The combination of psychological, material, and tactical considerations demonstrates the sophistication of Viking operational planning. By the end of the 9th century, monasteries had evolved into dual-purpose institutions, functioning as centers of devotion and nodes of strategic defense. Fortified walls, watchtowers, early warning networks, and mobile response units reflected lessons learned under sustained predation. Yet the psychological and material scars persisted. Fear, social disruption, and economic vulnerability remained deeply ingrained. The Norse, through speed, precision, and calculated terror, exercised influence far beyond the immediate reach of their longships. Chronicles, annals, and archaeological evidence collectively preserve this legacy, demonstrating the methodical and transformative nature of Viking raids. The assaults left an enduring mark on political, economic, and religious structures, highlighting the intersection of mobility, strategy, and societal resilience that defined the early medieval period. By the early 10th century, Viking raids had left an indelible mark on Northern European society. Coastal settlements, riverine communities, and monasteries had experienced repeated attacks, revealing vulnerabilities that reshaped both physical structures and social organization. Monasteries, once secure centers of worship, learning, and administration, were now forced into a state of constant vigilance. Survivors described the speed and precision with which raiders navigated rivers and coastlines, targeting wealth, manuscripts, and relics. The immediate physical destruction was severe, yet the social and psychological consequences extended far beyond individual sites. Religious practices were disrupted, economic networks weakened, and the authority of secular rulers challenged. Repeated raids demonstrated that the Vikings' influence extended far beyond material gain, reshaping social structures and compelling communities to adapt. Communities responded with incremental adaptation. Monasteries moved relics and manuscripts inland or to fortified locations to preserve intellectual and spiritual capital. Defensive architecture evolved. Timber walls were replaced with stone, gates were reinforced, and watchtowers were constructed to monitor river and coastal approaches. Archaeological evidence from Repton, Jarrow, and Iona shows layers of fortification interspersed with ash deposits, indicating multiple cycles of destruction and rebuilding. Even with these improvements, raiders could bypass or overwhelm defenses. Longships allowed rapid strikes and withdrawal before organized resistance could respond. Adaptation therefore relied on a combination of structural reinforcement, procedural planning, and psychological preparation, reflecting a pragmatic understanding of a mobile and unpredictable enemy. Environmental and seasonal awareness enhanced Viking effectiveness. Raids were timed for late spring or early summer, when rivers were navigable and tides favorable. In colder regions, frozen waterways allowed access to inland settlements otherwise considered secure. Chroniclers also emphasized that attacks often coincided with political distractions, such as succession disputes or regional conflicts, ensuring minimal organized defense. Geography and timing were systematically exploited to maximize surprise and amplify psychological impact. Rivers, estuaries, tidal flats, and coastal inlets became tactical instruments, reflecting the Vikings' sophisticated awareness of environmental conditions as a key component of operational strategy. The psychological consequences of repeated raids were profound. Survivors reported widespread fear, displacement, and disruption of normal life. Villages along rivers and coasts were abandoned in favor of fortified towns or inland relocation. Agricultural activity declined, trade slowed, and local governance was strained. Monks, who had relied on sanctity for protection, faced trauma as raiders desecrated sacred spaces and killed clergy. Chroniclers emphasize that the perception of invincibility often carried more weight than the physical destruction itself. Fear became a strategic multiplier, compelling communities to allocate resources toward defense rather than production or worship, extending the raiders' influence far beyond the immediate attack. Economic disruption amplified social and psychological effects. Monasteries served as centers of production, storage, and trade. Looted stores and livestock undermined subsistence, while stolen treasure reduced fiscal capacity for abbots and rulers alike. Repeated assaults along rivers such as the Seine and Loire disrupted commerce, reducing revenue and forcing defensive investment. Numismatic evidence shows reduced circulation in heavily raided regions, reflecting both physical loss and diminished confidence in economic stability. Material deprivation, combined with social disruption and fear, ensured long-term vulnerability, giving the Vikings strategic leverage without the need for prolonged occupation. The destruction of knowledge further destabilized communities. Libraries, scriptoria, and archives housed manuscripts, religious texts, and administrative records accumulated over generations. Fire, looting, and dispersal disrupted literacy, clerical administration, and scholarly continuity. Surviving monks often relocated fragments to secondary sites, where resources were insufficient for proper preservation. Archaeological evidence of charred manuscripts and burned buildings confirms widespread intellectual loss. By targeting knowledge alongside wealth, raiders inflicted multidimensional harm, undermining social cohesion, governance, and cultural memory, and extending the consequences of each attack far beyond immediate material loss. Military adaptation became essential. Fortifications were strengthened with stone walls, timber palisades, and watchtowers, integrated with mobile militias capable of rapid deployment. Scouts monitored rivers and coastlines for early warning, allowing communities to prepare for imminent incursions. Effectiveness varied depending on leadership, terrain, and proximity to fortified towns. Archaeological evidence shows repeated cycles of construction and destruction, demonstrating incremental learning and adaptation. Defensive strategies combined static fortifications with responsive mobility, reflecting an understanding that speed and surprise were the Vikings' greatest advantages. Geopolitically, repeated raids reshaped power structures. Smaller polities consolidated under larger authorities to pool resources and coordinate defense. Ecclesiastical reform focused on safeguarding personnel, knowledge, and treasure in addition to devotional activity. Monasteries systematically documented raids, recording routes, patterns, and methods, forming early intelligence networks. These records informed regional planning and defensive coordination. Sustained attacks catalyzed institutional evolution, embedding security into governance, economic management, and religious administration, and shaping the long-term resilience of affected communities. Viking raids on monasteries exemplify asymmetric warfare. Raiders exploited speed, mobility, and psychological terror to achieve effects disproportionate to their numbers. Physical destruction was paired with social, economic, and cultural destabilization. Raids followed predictable patterns but struck unpredictably in timing, maintaining long-term vulnerability. Unlike conventional campaigns aimed at territorial conquest, Viking operations prioritized destabilization, resource extraction, and reputation building. Fear itself became a strategic tool, compelling communities to invest in defense, alter settlement patterns, and redirect economic activity toward survival rather than growth. By the 10th century, monasteries had evolved into dual-purpose institutions, serving both spiritual and defensive functions. Fortified walls, watchtowers, early warning systems, and mobile militias reflected lessons learned from repeated predation. Yet psychological and material scars remained. Fear, social disruption, and economic vulnerability persisted across regions. The Norse, through speed, precision, and calculated terror, exerted influence far beyond the reach of their longships. Chronicles, annals, and archaeological evidence preserve this systematic pattern, demonstrating the calculated, methodical, and transformative nature of Viking raids. Their assaults left enduring imprints on political, economic, and religious structures, highlighting the interplay of mobility, terror, and resilience that reshaped Northern Europe. The transition from seasonal raiding to sustained Viking presence marked a critical shift in the vulnerability of monasteries and surrounding communities. By the late 9th century, attacks were no longer isolated events, but part of a recurring cycle. Monasteries that had been raided once often became targets again after reconstruction, as wealth returned more quickly than effective defenses could be established. This repetition created a pattern of destruction and recovery that deepened both material loss and psychological strain. Communities began to understand that survival did not guarantee safety. Recovery itself became a risk, attracting further attention from raiders who recognized predictable rebuilding patterns. A key development in this shift was the practice of overwintering. Viking groups increasingly established temporary camps along rivers and coastlines rather than returning immediately to Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Repton indicates organized encampments with defensive structures and burial areas, reflecting a sustained presence. From these bases, raiders could launch multiple attacks within a region, exploiting familiarity with terrain and local conditions. The seasonal rhythm that once limited raids disappeared, replaced by continuous threat. Communities were forced into constant readiness, unable to rely on predictable intervals of safety. Monasteries attempted to adapt, but their responses were often insufficient against evolving tactics. Defensive measures improved gradually. Stone walls replaced timber, gates were reinforced, and watchtowers were constructed to monitor approaches. Some monasteries coordinated with nearby settlements, forming early warning networks using bells, fires, and messengers. Despite these efforts, the speed of Viking longships often rendered warnings ineffective. Raiders could travel swiftly along rivers, strike without prolonged engagement, and withdraw before organized resistance could respond. The imbalance between mobility and static defense remained a defining characteristic of these encounters. The strategic targeting of monasteries reflected an understanding of their broader role within regional systems. These institutions were centers of economic activity, managing land, labor, and resources. Attacks disrupted agricultural cycles, removed livestock, and destroyed stored goods essential for survival. The impact extended beyond monastic walls, affecting surrounding populations that depended on these institutions. Economic disruption spread outward, weakening local markets and reducing resilience. Raids were therefore not merely acts of plunder, but calculated strikes against interconnected systems, amplifying their effect across entire regions. Psychological pressure intensified as raids became more systematic. Chroniclers describe an atmosphere of persistent tension, where communities expected violence rather than feared its possibility. Religious life was altered as monasteries shifted focus from scholarship and ritual to defense and preservation. The desecration of sacred spaces carried symbolic weight. Altars were overturned, relics stolen or scattered, and buildings burned, undermining the perceived sanctity of these institutions. This erosion of spiritual security forced communities to confront the limits of religious protection, reshaping their understanding of safety and authority. Viking strategy also evolved in scale and coordination. Raiding groups grew larger, and multiple parties sometimes operated simultaneously within a region. This allowed for attacks on several monasteries or settlements in quick succession, overwhelming local defenses. River systems such as the Seine, Loire, and Thames served as strategic corridors, enabling rapid movement between targets. The ability to strike repeatedly and unpredictably compounded the difficulty of organizing effective resistance. Coordination among raiders increased efficiency, demonstrating an evolving operational sophistication. In response, secular authorities expanded defensive infrastructure. Fortified towns were constructed or strengthened, serving as refuges for populations and bases for military response. Monasteries were increasingly integrated into these defensive networks, marking a shift from isolated religious centers to components of broader security systems. Cooperation between secular and ecclesiastical leadership improved, reflecting a shared need for coordinated defense. However, effectiveness varied widely. Some regions developed strong defensive systems, while others remained exposed due to limited resources or fragmented authority. Settlement patterns changed under sustained pressure. Populations moved away from vulnerable coastal and riverine areas toward fortified inland locations. Agricultural practices adapted, with fields relocated or abandoned to reduce exposure. Trade routes shifted, favoring safer paths and altering regional economies. The physical landscape reflected these changes as defensive structures became more common and previously active areas declined. Archaeological evidence reveals these transformations, illustrating how repeated raids reshaped both human behavior and environmental organization. Cultural consequences were significant. The destruction of manuscripts and centers of learning disrupted intellectual continuity. Monasteries that survived often reduced their functions, focusing on essential religious duties while abandoning broader scholarly roles. The loss of texts affected theology, law, and historical record-keeping, creating gaps in knowledge. Some materials were preserved through relocation, but fragmentation limited accessibility and coherence. This cultural contraction compounded social and economic disruption, reinforcing the long-term impact of raids. Over time, sustained Viking activity reshaped concepts of power and authority. Political legitimacy became increasingly tied to the ability to provide protection. Rulers who organized effective defenses gained influence, while those who failed saw their authority weakened. This encouraged centralization and the development of more structured administrative systems. Monasteries, once primarily spiritual institutions, became indicators of strategic importance, their survival linked to broader defensive networks. The integration of religious, economic, and military considerations marked a transformation in medieval society. By the end of the 9th century, Viking interaction with monasteries had evolved into a complex dynamic of conflict and adaptation. Raids were no longer isolated acts, but part of a sustained process that reshaped institutions and communities. Defensive measures improved, coordination increased, and societies adapted, yet the fundamental advantage of mobility and surprise remained with the raiders. The legacy of these encounters was not only destruction but transformation, as communities reorganized themselves under constant threat, altering political, economic, and religious structures across Northern Europe. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, Viking activity along the coasts and rivers of Northern Europe had evolved into a sustained system of pressure that reshaped both defensive strategy and political authority. Monasteries, which had once been predictable victims of sudden raids, now existed within a broader landscape, defined by continuous threat. The transformation was not only military but structural. Communities began to anticipate attacks as recurring events rather than isolated crises. This shift altered how resources were allocated, how authority was exercised, and how survival itself was understood. The presence of Viking forces, whether actively raiding or positioned within nearby encampments, created an environment in which no region could consider itself beyond reach. The increasing permanence of Viking encampments played a central role in this transformation. Overwintering evolved into semi-permanent settlement in certain regions, allowing raiders to maintain operational continuity across seasons. These bases, often located along strategic river systems, functioned as hubs for coordinated movement and repeated incursions. Archaeological findings reveal structured layouts, evidence of craft production, and burial practices, indicating communities rather than temporary camps. From these positions, Viking groups could control access points, monitor regional activity, and launch attacks with greater precision. This development blurred the line between raiding and occupation, creating a hybrid form of presence that combined mobility with localized stability. Monasteries responded by further integrating themselves into defensive networks. The construction of fortified enclosures became more standardized, with attention given to both durability and strategic placement. Walls were thickened, entrances narrowed, and elevated positions utilized for surveillance. Some monasteries were relocated entirely to more defensible terrain, reflecting a willingness to sacrifice traditional locations for security. Coordination with nearby, fortified towns increased, creating systems in which warnings could be transmitted and reinforcements mobilized more effectively. Despite these advancements, the challenge of responding to rapid, unpredictable attacks persisted. Even improved defenses could be circumvented if raiders chose alternative routes or exploited weaknesses in coordination. The evolution of Viking tactics reinforced this imbalance. Raiding parties became more flexible, adjusting size and composition according to objectives. Smaller groups could conduct swift strikes on lightly defended targets, while larger forces could engage in more sustained operations against fortified locations. The use of intelligence, whether through reconnaissance or prior experience, allowed raiders to identify vulnerabilities with increasing accuracy. Knowledge of local geography, gained through repeated incursions or prolonged presence, enhanced their ability to navigate and exploit terrain. Rivers remained central to this strategy, serving as arteries through which movement, supply, and communication could be maintained with efficiency. Psychological pressure remained a defining element of Viking operations. The normalization of threat altered collective behavior, embedding caution and preparedness into daily life. Monasteries adjusted routines to account for potential attack, prioritizing the safeguarding of valuable items and the readiness of defensive measures. The symbolic impact of repeated desecration continued to resonate, reinforcing the perception that sacred spaces offered no immunity. This erosion of spiritual security had broader implications, influencing how communities perceived authority, protection, and divine favor. Fear was no longer episodic. It became structural, shaping decisions at both individual and institutional levels. Economic systems adapted under sustained strain. The repeated targeting of monasteries and surrounding lands disrupted cycles of production and exchange, forcing communities to diversify and relocate economic activity. Storage practices changed, with goods dispersed across multiple locations to reduce the risk of total loss. Trade networks adjusted routes to avoid high-risk areas, while fortified towns became focal points for exchange. These adaptations mitigated some effects of raids, but also altered economic geography, concentrating activity in defensible centers and reducing the viability of more exposed regions. The redistribution of resources reflected a broader shift toward resilience, though often at the cost of efficiency and growth. The role of leadership became increasingly critical in this environment. Rulers were judged not only by their capacity to govern, but by their ability to protect. Effective coordination of defense, including the maintenance of fortifications and the organization of response forces, became central to political legitimacy. In some regions, this led to the consolidation of power, as smaller authorities aligned under stronger leaders capable of providing security. Monasteries, once largely autonomous in their internal affairs, became more closely tied to secular power structures. Their survival depended on integration into wider systems of defense and administration, reinforcing the interconnected nature of religious and political authority. Cultural adaptation accompanied these structural changes. The production of manuscripts and scholarly work continued, but under constrained conditions. Efforts were made to preserve texts through duplication and dispersal, though losses remained significant. The experience of repeated raids influenced narrative traditions, shaping how events were recorded and remembered. Chronicles emphasized themes of destruction, resilience, and divine interpretation, reflecting attempts to understand and contextualize ongoing instability. This evolving narrative framework contributed to a shared memory of Viking activity, reinforcing its significance within the historical consciousness of affected regions. Military organization also evolved in response to sustained threat. Systems of local defense were supplemented by more coordinated regional strategies, integrating fortifications with mobile forces capable of responding to incursions. Training, communication, and logistical planning improved incrementally, reflecting lessons learned from repeated encounters. The balance between static defense and dynamic response remained a central concern, as communities sought to counter the advantages of speed and surprise. While these adaptations reduced vulnerability in some areas, they could not eliminate the fundamental challenge posed by highly mobile raiders operating across interconnected waterways. By the early 10th century, the interaction between Viking forces and monastic communities had developed into a complex system of conflict and adaptation. Raids continued, but they occurred within a landscape that had been reshaped by decades of pressure. Monasteries were no longer passive targets. They were active participants in defensive networks, their structures and practices reflecting accumulated experience. Yet the underlying dynamics remained unchanged. Mobility, environmental awareness, and psychological impact continued to define Viking strategy, ensuring that even improved defenses could be tested and sometimes overcome. The legacy of this period was one of transformation rather than resolution. The sustained presence of Viking forces forced societies to adapt at every level, from architecture and economy to governance and culture. Monasteries, once symbols of stability and continuity, became indicators of resilience and strategic importance. Their survival depended not only on faith, but on integration into systems of defense and coordination. The shadow of the longship persisted, not merely as a threat of violence, but as a catalyst for change, shaping the evolution of Northern European society in lasting and profound ways. By the early 10th century, the sustained interaction between Viking forces and monastic communities had developed into a prolonged contest defined by adaptation and endurance. Monasteries were no longer isolated sanctuaries, but exposed elements within a landscape shaped by constant threat. Repeated raids had altered institutional behavior, transforming reactive responses into structured systems of preparedness. Communities understood that attacks were not anomalies, but recurring events. This awareness reshaped how resources were managed, how authority functioned, and how survival itself was organized. Despite improvements in defense, the Vikings retained the advantage of initiative, determining the timing and location of attacks while their targets remained in a constant state of anticipation. The effectiveness of Viking operations depended heavily on control of maritime and riverine routes. These waterways allowed raiders to move with speed and flexibility, reaching inland regions previously considered secure. Rivers such as the Thames, Seine, and Loire acted as extensions of the sea, enabling deep incursions into populated areas. Monasteries situated along these routes faced increased exposure, as accessibility made them valuable and vulnerable simultaneously. The Norse demonstrated a detailed understanding of these networks, using them not only for movement, but for coordination and retreat. Geography became a central component of their strategy, ensuring that distance alone could not guarantee safety. Defensive strategies continued to evolve in response to persistent raids. Monasteries incorporated stronger architectural features, including reinforced stone walls, narrower entry points, and elevated observation positions. Some sites used natural barriers, such as rivers or elevated ground, to enhance protection. In certain cases, entire communities relocated to more defensible terrain, prioritizing security over tradition. These changes reflected a shift in priorities as preservation of life and resources became central concerns. However, even these adaptations had limits. Viking mobility allowed raiders to bypass defenses, strike at weaker points, and withdraw before effective resistance could be organized. Coordination between monasteries and secular authorities became increasingly systematic. Early warning systems were expanded, with signals transmitted between settlements to indicate approaching ships. Fortified towns acted as centers of resistance, providing refuge and organizing defensive responses. Monasteries became integrated into these networks, contributing to collective security. This cooperation marked a transformation in the relationship between religious and political institutions. Protection required coordination, resource sharing, and strategic planning. While these systems improved resilience, their effectiveness depended on communication and timing, both of which remained vulnerable to disruption. The psychological impact of continuous threat shaped daily life. Communities adapted to a state in which fear was constant rather than episodic. Monastic routines incorporated measures for safeguarding valuables and preparing for sudden attack. The repeated desecration of sacred spaces eroded the perception of spiritual protection, forcing communities to reconsider assumptions about safety and divine favor. Fear became embedded in social behavior, influencing decisions about settlement, labor, and resource allocation. This psychological adaptation extended the influence of Viking raids beyond physical destruction, shaping the mental and cultural landscape of affected regions. Economic systems also adjusted under sustained pressure. The concentration of wealth in monasteries became a liability, leading to the dispersal of resources across multiple locations. Storage practices changed to reduce the risk of total loss during raids. Trade routes shifted towards safer inland centers, while fortified towns emerged as hubs of economic activity. These changes altered regional economies, redistributing activity and reducing dependence on vulnerable locations. While such adaptations improved resilience, they introduced inefficiencies and limited growth, reflecting the cost of operating under persistent threat. Cultural consequences continued to unfold alongside these structural changes. The destruction of manuscripts and learning centers had already disrupted intellectual continuity, but efforts to preserve knowledge persisted. Monasteries copied and relocated texts, attempting to safeguard what remained. Chroniclers recorded events with an emphasis on destruction and endurance, shaping a narrative framework that reflected ongoing instability. These records contributed to a shared cultural memory, reinforcing the significance of Viking activity and shaping historical identity. The loss of knowledge and the effort to preserve it became central themes in the evolving cultural landscape. Military organization grew more structured in response to prolonged conflict. Defensive systems integrated fortified positions with mobile forces capable of responding to incursions. Communication improved, allowing for more coordinated action across regions. Training and readiness became more consistent, reflecting accumulated experience. Despite these advancements, the challenge of countering Viking mobility remained. Raiders retained the ability to choose the moment of engagement, limiting the effectiveness of defensive preparations and ensuring continued vulnerability. The nature of Viking presence also influenced patterns of interaction beyond conflict. In some regions, prolonged contact led to exchange and eventual integration between Norse groups and local populations. While monasteries remained frequent targets during active raids, The broader context included periods of coexistence and negotiation. This complexity illustrates that Viking activity was not solely destructive, but also transformative, influencing social and cultural dynamics over time. The distinction between raider and settler became less rigid in certain areas, adding nuance to the overall pattern of interaction. Settlement patterns reflected these changes. Populations moved away from exposed coastal and riverine areas, concentrating in fortified locations that offered greater protection. Agricultural practices adapted, with cultivation shifting to less vulnerable land. Trade networks adjusted to align with new centers of security. The physical landscape changed accordingly, as defensive structures became prominent features and previously active areas declined. Archaeological evidence supports these observations, revealing how sustained pressure reshaped both human behavior and environmental organization. By the mid-10th century, monasteries had become integrated into broader systems of defense and governance. They functioned not only as centers of religious activity, but as components of strategic networks designed to manage risk and ensure survival. Secular authorities reinforced their legitimacy through protection, linking political power to defensive capability. The interaction between Viking forces and monastic communities had evolved into a continuous process of adaptation and response, shaping institutions and societies at every level. The legacy of this period was one of transformation. Monasteries, once symbols of stability, became indicators of resilience within a changing world. Viking activity forced societies to adapt, reshaping political authority, economic organization, and cultural identity. The advantage of mobility and psychological impact remained with the raiders, ensuring their continued influence. The shadow of the longship persisted as a defining feature of the age, shaping the trajectory of Northern European society through sustained pressure and adaptation. By the mid to late 10th century, the long phase of Viking pressure had begun to reshape not only defensive systems, but the deeper structure of society across Northern Europe. Monasteries, once passive targets of sudden violence, had become embedded within networks of protection, communication, and strategic planning. Yet the threat had not disappeared. Instead, it had evolved into a more complex and enduring presence. Raids still occurred, but they were now part of a broader interaction that combined conflict, adaptation, and gradual transformation. Communities no longer responded with shock alone. They operated within a framework of expectation, adjusting behavior to a reality in which danger remained constant. The continuity of Viking activity was sustained by their mastery of movement across interconnected waterways. Rivers and coasts functioned as extensions of a unified operational space, allowing forces to travel efficiently between distant regions. Monasteries situated along these routes remained vulnerable despite improved defenses, as accessibility continued to outweigh isolation. The Norse exploited this geography with precision, selecting targets based on both opportunity and strategic value. Their familiarity with terrain, gained through repeated incursions and prolonged presence, enhanced their ability to navigate and adapt. This environmental awareness ensured that even fortified regions could be tested, maintaining pressure across wide areas without requiring permanent occupation. Defensive systems reached a new level of organization during this period. Fortified towns were linked through communication networks, enabling faster responses to approaching threats. Monasteries contributed to these systems, acting as observation points and storage centers within a broader defensive framework. Architectural improvements continued, with thicker walls, reinforced gates, and more deliberate layouts designed to control access and delay attackers. In some cases, entire monastic communities relocated to sites offering natural defensive advantages. These measures reflected a shift toward strategic planning, as defense became an integrated and permanent aspect of institutional life rather than an improvised reaction. Despite these advancements, the fundamental challenge of responding to mobile raiders remained unresolved. Viking forces retained the ability to choose when and where to strike, preserving the advantage of initiative. Even well-coordinated defenses could be bypassed or overwhelmed if timing and positioning favor the attackers. This imbalance ensured that no system of protection could guarantee complete security. Instead, defense became a matter of mitigation, reducing the impact of raids rather than preventing them entirely. Communities adapted to this limitation, focusing on resilience and recovery as much as on resistance. The psychological dimension of Viking activity continued to shape behavior across generations. Fear, once an immediate response to sudden violence, had become embedded within cultural and social structures. Monastic routines incorporated contingency measures, ensuring that valuables could be concealed or relocated quickly. The repeated violation of sacred spaces had lasting symbolic consequences, weakening the perception of spiritual immunity. Communities learned to balance faith with practical caution, integrating defensive awareness into daily life. This shift in mindset represented a profound transformation, as the concept of security became grounded in preparation rather than belief alone. Economic systems adapted in parallel with these changes. The concentration of wealth in single locations was reduced, with resources distributed to minimize risk. Trade networks shifted towards safer routes, often centered around fortified towns that could offer protection. Markets adjusted to these new conditions, reflecting a redistribution of economic activity across the landscape. While these adaptations improved resilience, they also introduced constraints, limiting expansion and reinforcing a defensive orientation. The long-term effect was a more cautious and localized economic structure, shaped by the need to withstand repeated disruption. Cultural life continued under these conditions, though altered in scope and focus. The destruction of manuscripts and centers of learning had already reduced intellectual capacity in many regions, but efforts to preserve knowledge persisted. Monasteries copied texts and relocated collections, seeking to maintain continuity despite ongoing threats. Chroniclers documented events with increasing attention to detail, recording not only destruction but also patterns of adaptation and survival. These records contributed to a shared understanding of the era, embedding the experience of Viking activity within collective memory. The cultural response to sustained threat became an essential component of resilience, preserving identity in the face of disruption. Military organization matured further as experience accumulated. Defensive systems integrated static fortifications with mobile response units, creating layered strategies designed to counter different forms of attack. Communication improved, allowing for more coordinated action across regions. Training and readiness became more consistent, reflecting a recognition that preparedness was essential to survival. While these measures reduced vulnerability in certain areas, they could not eliminate the fundamental advantages of speed and flexibility that characterized Viking operations. The balance between defense and mobility remained a central tension. The broader interaction between Viking groups and local populations also continued to evolve. In some regions, prolonged contact led to negotiation, exchange, and gradual integration. Settlements established by Norse groups became part of the local landscape, contributing to economic and cultural exchange. This process did not erase the memory or reality of raids, but it added complexity to the relationship, illustrating how sustained interaction could produce both conflict and adaptation. Monasteries remained symbols of vulnerability during periods of violence, yet they also existed within a broader context of shifting alliances and identities. Settlement patterns reflected the cumulative effects of these changes. Populations concentrated in defensible locations, abandoning or reducing activity in exposed areas. Agricultural practices adjusted to align with new settlement patterns, while trade routes adapted to prioritize safety. The physical landscape was reshaped by these decisions, with fortifications, watchtowers, and reorganized settlements becoming defining features. Archaeological evidence supports these transformations, demonstrating how sustained pressure influenced both human behavior and environmental organization over time. By the late 10th century, Monasteries had fully integrated defensive considerations into their existence. They functioned as centers of worship, learning, and strategy, reflecting the demands of a world shaped by continuous threat. Secular authorities reinforced their power through the ability to coordinate and protect, linking governance to security. The interaction between Viking forces and monastic communities had evolved into a dynamic system of pressure and response, in which each adaptation prompted further adjustment. The legacy of this period was one of enduring transformation. Viking activity had forced societies to reconsider the nature of security, authority, and resilience. Monasteries, once defined by isolation and sanctity, became interconnected elements of a broader defensive and social network. The persistence of mobility, environmental awareness, and psychological impact ensure that the influence of Viking strategy extended beyond direct conflict. The shadow of their presence continued to shape the trajectory of Northern European society, leaving a lasting imprint on its political, economic, and cultural development. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the long cycle of Viking pressure had begun to enter a new phase, one defined less by sudden terror alone and more by structural transformation across Northern Europe. Monasteries, once repeatedly shattered by coastal raids, had adapted into fortified and networked institutions, yet their vulnerability never fully disappeared. The memory of destruction remained active, shaping both institutional behavior and broader societal expectations. Even as some regions experienced relative stability, the strategic lessons learned from decades of incursions continued to influence defensive planning, governance, and economic organization. The Viking threat had become embedded within the system itself, no longer an external anomaly, but a factor that shaped internal development. The persistence of maritime mobility ensured that Viking influence did not vanish with the rise of stronger defensive networks. Rivers and coastlines remained conduits of movement, allowing forces to shift rapidly between regions. Monasteries located along these routes retained their strategic significance, not only as potential targets, but as nodes within defensive and communication systems. The Norse understanding of geography continued to shape their actions, even as their role evolved in certain areas from raiders to settlers or political actors. The same waterways that once delivered sudden violence now facilitated trade, negotiation, and integration, illustrating the dual nature of mobility as both threat and opportunity. Defensive systems reached a level of maturity during this period, reflecting accumulated experience. Fortified towns, interconnected by communication networks, provided a degree of regional security that had been absent in earlier centuries. Monasteries contributed actively to these systems, serving as observation points, storage centers, and places of refuge. Architectural design reflected these functions, with controlled access points, reinforced structures, and deliberate spatial organization. Defense was no longer improvised but institutionalized, embedded within the planning and operation of both religious and secular communities. Yet even this sophistication could not entirely eliminate vulnerability, as the capacity for rapid movement remained a decisive advantage for any force able to exploit it. The psychological legacy of earlier raids continued to shape behavior. Generations that had inherited stories of destruction maintained a cautious approach to security and resource management. Monastic life incorporated defensive readiness as a routine element, ensuring that valuable objects could be protected or relocated quickly. The symbolic impact of past desecrations endured, reinforcing a pragmatic understanding of the limits of sacred protection. This cultural memory functioned as a form of collective experience, guiding decisions and shaping expectations long after the most intense periods of raiding had passed. Fear had evolved into vigilance, an enduring awareness that influenced both individual and institutional conduct. Economic systems reflected similar patterns of adaptation. The dispersal of wealth, the redirection of trade routes, and the concentration of markets within fortified centers had become normalized practices. Monasteries continued to play important roles in production and exchange, but their operations were adjusted to reduce risk. Storage was decentralized, and resources were managed with an emphasis on resilience rather than accumulation in single locations. These changes altered regional economies, creating structures that were more resistant to disruption but less dynamic in expansion. The balance between security and growth remained a central tension, reflecting the long-term impact of sustained external pressure. Cultural life adapted within these constraints, maintaining continuity while adjusting to new realities. Manuscript production continued, though often under conditions that prioritized preservation over expansion. Monasteries remained centers of learning, but their intellectual output was shaped by the need to protect existing knowledge. Chroniclers recorded events with a heightened awareness of instability, integrating accounts of raids, defenses, and recovery into broader historical narratives. These writings contributed to a shared cultural framework that emphasized resilience and adaptation, reinforcing the lessons learned from previous generations. The experience of Viking activity became a defining element of historical consciousness. Military organization, refined through decades of conflict, achieved greater coherence. Systems of defense combined fortified positions with mobile forces capable of responding to incursions across regions. Communication networks allowed for more effective coordination, reducing response times and improving the capacity to concentrate forces where needed. Training and preparedness became standardized, reflecting the institutionalization of defense as a central function of governance. While these developments reduced the effectiveness of smaller raiding parties, they also contributed to the gradual transformation of Viking groups themselves, as the conditions that had once favored rapid, isolated strikes became more challenging to exploit. The relationship between Viking populations and local societies continued to evolve. In several regions, Norse groups had established settlements that became integrated into existing political and economic systems. These communities participated in trade, governance, and cultural exchange, contributing to a more complex interaction than earlier periods of pure conflict. Monasteries, while still symbols of vulnerability during periods of unrest, also existed within this broader context of interaction. The boundary between external threat and internal participant became increasingly blurred, reflecting the long-term consequences of sustained contact. Settlement patterns stabilized in response to these developments. Populations remained concentrated in defensible locations, but these centers became more permanent and structured. Agricultural practices adjusted to support these settlements, while trade networks aligned with established routes and markets. The landscape reflected a balance between security and sustainability, with fortifications integrated into the environment as enduring features rather than temporary responses. Archaeological evidence illustrates this stabilization, showing continuity in settlement alongside the persistence of defensive infrastructure. By the early 11th century, monasteries had become fully integrated into the political and defensive systems of their regions. Their survival depended on coordination, resource management, and alignment with broader structures of authority. Secular rulers reinforced their legitimacy through protection, while religious institutions adapted to operate within this framework. The interaction between Viking forces and monastic communities had evolved from episodic violence into a complex process of adaptation, integration, and transformation. The initial shock of raids had given way to a sustained reconfiguration of society, influencing every aspect of life from governance to culture. The legacy of Viking raids on monasteries was therefore not limited to destruction. It encompassed a transformation of structures, behaviors, and relationships that reshaped Northern Europe over centuries. Mobility, environmental awareness, and psychological impact remained central to this process, even as their expression changed over time. Monasteries, once isolated and vulnerable, became resilient components of interconnected systems. The enduring influence of Viking strategy lay in its ability to force adaptation, leaving a lasting imprint on the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the medieval world. By the early 11th century, the prolonged era of Viking interaction with monasteries had reached a stage defined not by constant shock, but by deep and lasting transformation. What began as sudden, devastating coastal raids had evolved into a structural force that reshaped institutions, landscapes, and patterns of life across Northern Europe. Monasteries, once isolated centers of worship and learning, had been forced into a new reality. They no longer existed as untouched sanctuaries, but as fortified, interconnected elements within wider systems of defense and governance. The scars of repeated attacks remained embedded in collective memory, influencing behavior long after the most intense periods of violence had passed. The Viking world itself had also undergone a parallel transformation. Groups that had once depended primarily on rapid, opportunistic raiding increasingly settled in the regions they had targeted. In parts of England and Francia, Norse leaders established authority, integrating into local political systems. This shift altered the nature of the threat. Monasteries were no longer dealing solely with distant raiders arriving without warning, but also with nearby populations of Scandinavian origin who were now part of the regional structure. The boundary between external enemy and internal participant became increasingly blurred, adding complexity to an already evolving situation. Defensive strategies, refined over generations, had become a permanent feature of society. Fortified towns formed the backbone of regional security, linked by communication networks that allowed warnings to travel faster than in earlier centuries. Monasteries were woven into these systems, functioning as observation points, storage centers, and places of refuge. Their architecture reflected the lessons of repeated exposure to violence. Thickened stone walls, controlled entryways, and elevated positions were no longer exceptional measures, but standard features. Defense had shifted from reaction to routine, embedded into daily life and long-term planning. Yet despite these advancements, the fundamental challenge remained unresolved. Mobility had always been the Vikings' greatest advantage, and it continued to shape the balance of power. Even as defenses improved, no region could be considered completely secure. Rivers and coastlines remained open pathways, capable of delivering sudden threats despite layers of protection. Communities understood this limitation and adjusted accordingly. Security was no longer defined as absolute safety, but as the ability to withstand, recover, and adapt. The psychological consequences of earlier raids endured in subtle but powerful ways. Collective memory preserved the experience of violence, shaping how people approached risk and authority. Monasteries maintained procedures for protecting valuables, and their daily routines reflected an awareness that danger, though less frequent, had not disappeared. The repeated desecration of sacred spaces in previous generations had altered perceptions of spiritual protection. Faith remained central, but it was accompanied by a practical understanding that survival required preparation as much as belief. Economic life reflected this same balance between caution and continuity. Trade networks stabilized around fortified centers, where goods could be exchanged under relative protection. Monasteries continue to play important roles in production and storage, but their methods emphasized resilience. Resources were no longer concentrated in single locations, but distributed to reduce the risk of total loss. This approach created stability, yet also limited expansion, reinforcing a pattern of careful management shaped by past disruption. Cultural recovery progressed gradually. The destruction of manuscripts and centers of learning in earlier centuries had left lasting gaps, but efforts to preserve and reproduce knowledge continued. Monasteries resumed their intellectual functions, though often with greater emphasis on safeguarding what remained. Chroniclers documented the history of raids and adaptation, ensuring that the lessons of the past were not lost. These records contributed to a shared identity rooted in endurance, shaping how societies understood both their vulnerabilities and their resilience. Military organization reached a level of coordination that reflected generations of experience. Fortifications, communication systems, and trained response forces combined to create more effective defenses. While these measures reduced the frequency and impact of raids, they could not entirely eliminate the underlying threat. The balance between defense and mobility remained a defining feature of the era, ensuring that preparedness continued to be a central concern. By this stage, monasteries had become symbols not only of faith but of survival within a changing world. Their transformation mirrored the broader evolution of Northern European society, shaped by sustained external pressure and internal adaptation. The legacy of Viking raids was therefore not limited to destruction. It extended into the reorganization of political authority, the restructuring of economic systems, and the reshaping of cultural identity. The shadow of the longship, once a sign of sudden terror, became a reminder of how deeply societies could change when forced to confront persistent and calculated threat.